Welcome, everyone. I am so excited. Woke up this morning like a little kid, just buzzing that I was going to spend an hour with my friend, Dr. Loree Sutton, who is running for mayor of New York City. And I was just thinking, how appropriate to have a psychiatrist run New York City, given the insanity of this political season that we are in. Loree and I both trained in the military. We're both military psychiatrists. Loree went to medical school at Loma Linda University, which is actually where Tana, my wife, did her nursing school and was a level A trauma nurse at Loma Linda. Loree spent a long career in the Army and retired as a brigadier general, which meant she was involved in policy and programs in making the Army a better place for its soldiers. We met when she was appointed to the Veteran Commission by the current mayor of New York, and talked about our work with imaging and so on. But as I've gotten to know Loree, I just am become a huge fan of her work. And I wanted to give our audience, especially our audience in New York, a chance to meet Loree. So Loree, thank you for spending time with me.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel. This is a real treat. I woke up this morning all buzzed and excited as well. So thank you for inviting me.
So tell people your story. How did you get to this point? You know, I'm a child psychiatrist by training, and development is always so important to me. But whenever I listen to a speaker, I always want to know the backstory to know why I should listen to them.
Well, I'll tell you. So here's the Loree story. How's that? I didn't start out in medical school thinking that I would go to psychiatry. I was always involved in fitness and sports, and my mom was a cardiac nurse. My grandpa was an old-time country doc. He used to take me on house calls with him, and he was from Texas, and he had his grips. And one of the things I noticed early on was when my grandpa would go and we'd go on house calls and he'd come in, he started talking to his patients and to their family members. And he always caught up with them in terms of the relationship. How are they doing? What's going on? He remembered details. And I could just see the patients just relax and the family members relax. And it taught me a lot early on about just how critical relationships are. And just, a few years later, I had heard about the Army's health professional scholarship programs when I was in college in organic chemistry class. I went to a small college, Pacific Union College, in the Napa Valley. And looking back on this was late 70s Northern California. Daniel, it was not a hotbed for military recruiting. But looking back, I'm sure that these Air Force recruiters, possibly they wanted to do a little wine tasting. They saw a college there. Let's check the block. And it sowed really a seed that if I, decided to go into medical school, got a letter of acceptance, that I could then apply for a scholarship. And so a couple of years later, I had that letter of acceptance. When I applied for the scholarship, Daniel, I didn't tell my friends, my family. I went down, some of my high school buddies, we were going to meet at Laguna Beach. And I said, go down there, I'll meet you. And the medical recruiters station at Santa Ana, I walked in, 4 booths. Never occurred to me I'd have to pick a service. And this is the honest truth. I looked at it, I said, I only have time to fill out one application. The Army line was the shortest. And so serendipity, fate, providence, whatever it was, that's how I ended up in the Army. Now, how I got into psychiatry was very much related to a child psychologist, my first semester of medical school, Dr. Blake Kesey. He gave us a series of lectures on early childhood development. And Daniel, when I witnessed his passion, his love for his patients, matched only by his love and respect for the burgeoning knowledge that was coming out of neuroscience, what we were learning about the brain, I was hooked. I loved so many different parts of medical school, even surgery. I held the forceps for baby Faye a couple of years later, but I never lost that just that tug, that passion. And it taught me a lot about mentorship and the responsibility I would then have to convey my passion to others. And you never know what might happen.
How exciting. Speaking of Pacific Angwin College, or Pacific Union College in Angwin, my first clinic was in Fairfield, very close. And I became very close friends to the director of the counseling center there. And I treated dozens of those students. So I was a huge fan of that college.
See, we've been just linked together in ways that are continuing to unfold. It's truly an unbidden blessing, Daniel. Thank you again.
Yeah, no, I love all these points of connection. And so you went to medical school, you decided to be a psychiatrist, and did you do your internship at Letterman?
I did. I did my internship and my residency. And keep in mind, this was now 85 through 89. You know, when I was still in medical school, I did a rotation down at UCLA, and we were starting to, see some of these strange cases, young men in the prime of their lives who were coming down with very grave illnesses and dying. And of course, it was the early manifestations of what has become, HIV and AIDS. And when I went to San Francisco, then I'll tell you, very early on in my internship, one of my first patients had what they then called HTLV4, but we didn't know a lot about it then. We didn't know that this virus could actually attack the central nervous system and manifest with behavioral and autonomic and all kinds of odd manifestations. And those early experiences and watching what was happening in New York City and understanding the political movements that were afoot and watching, Polk Street just die as a street, as its members, as the community. And I had a lesson during those 4 years, which not only entailed the AIDS epidemic. And of course, you may recall there was a 4-star general at that time, chief of staff of the Army, who said, well, we don't have to worry about this in the military because we don't have any of those people. Well, of course, that was not exactly the case. And I will say, Dr. Redfield, isn't that strange how, full circle today, he was one of the early pioneers, an Army doc who did some of the early research and insisted on quality clinical care, dignity, and respect for those who were suffering in such large and tragic numbers. So it was not only the AIDS epidemic, but it was also, really the swing of the women's movement. When I came into the Army in 1981, very, very few women leaders. In fact, the infantry battalion, I was the first woman assigned to an infantry battalion. They invited me to go to the Sinai, Egypt on a peacekeeping tour, 3-9 Infantry, the Manchus. The first day I went with the XO to the mess hall, a young private saw me and was so startled he dropped his lunch tray and the XO fell out. So he's never, you have to excuse me, he's never seen a female captain in his mess hall. So wow. I learned so many things there. I also, this was shortly after, you'll recall, of course, that PTSD had just recently been established as a diagnosis within the DSM. for the APA. And I walked into not only my military department at Letterman Army Medical Center, but by extension, the Army invested in training and education with UCSF and Stanford and, some of the finest medical and psychiatric minds in the world. And what I kept hearing in those early months of internship and residency was, do you believe in PTSD?
My first paper was 1982. I was an intern. Was post-Vietnam stress disorder a metaphor for current and past life events? And we argued that what you bring into the Army is just as important as what you're like when you come out of the Army. Was sort of a big idea at the time. So as a military psychiatrist, you've been to many places, done many, many interesting things. Because I want you to talk about some of the issues and why you're running for mayor. How do you think those experiences shaped who you are today?
I think certainly I came out of those 4 years with a real reverence for data. Those early, in some cases, screaming matches about whether or not someone believed in PTSD. I said, where's the data? Let's go for the data. When it came to the AIDS crisis, I learned early on that the human suffering is human suffering. And let's get our arms around it. Let's put everything we've got to learn and to prevent and to provide the therapies and support to the families and loved ones. Also, I was early on, again, our APA in the early 70s had changed homosexuality from a psychiatric disorder per se. And of course, even the disorder was a step forward from what it had been earlier in the 20th century as a crime, as a sign of derangement. So I learned a lot about what it is to serve in a system where individuals are not free to just be who they are. And in things as simple as coming back from a weekend to be in a position of, making up stories or misrepresenting one's life. And so that had a very deep impression on me. And fundamentally, as I left my training, I was so thankful for the community orientation and the small townness of Loma Linda and the holistic orientation of my medical education. And then coming out of that time of duress in San Francisco, I realized that wherever my Army leadership experience would take me, and I had no earthly idea at that point, Daniel, that I would stay in for nearly 30 years, but I knew that it would be so important for whatever I heard as a leader, whether I was a physician or later in my career as a commander, that anything is possible. And that I must take seriously whatever the account or the story or the experience is that someone provides to me. And then I must ensure that I apply fully due process in respecting that experience, whether it be due process in the medical world of treatment and research and clinical support, or whether it be in the line army of understanding that I would hear, no doubt, because I had heard them during those 4 years, some of the most outlandish stories, which ended up actually being true. And that was a very important lesson. So, 2 years later, after graduating from residency, Daniel, I had served in the Sinai, Egypt with the infantry. My next follow-on assignment was in Germany. The wall came down 2 weeks after I got there. I was the division psychiatrist for 1st Armored Division, 25,000 troops. And the wall came down. spent the New Year's holiday up at the Brandenburg Gate, got my own little piece of the wall. But then, the division leaders felt like dinosaurs. Panama had just taken place. The largest tank was just a little Sheridan tank from World War II. Here we were with these 7-ton M1, M2 Abrams tanks. But again, I learned about leadership. Our division commander, old boy, a country boy from Georgia, he just said, we got to keep our eyes on the prize, and that's training and readiness. So when Saddam acted up that next August, our division became designated as the lead heavy armored division for the first Gulf War. My team, we had built a team with the chaplains and the first sergeants and the company commanders throughout the division. By the time we got to war, we had the relationship set up. So we ensured that every soldier who was having difficulty, we made sure that they had the basics, what command and combat psychiatry had told us since World War II. Sleep, hydration, social support, to ensure that we had every possible chance of keeping that soldier forward in his or her unit. And about 70% of the time we were able to do that. And our team was designated as the most effective program in the Gulf and the theater during that war. And that experience coming out, I turned my life upside down. I then realized that as a psychiatrist, if I could even contribute just a little bit to the health and the wholeness and the well-being of our troops and their families, whom I had grown to deeply, deeply love and respect, I just thought this would be a life worth living. So
you're actually talking about brain health, that if we could keep the brains of our soldiers healthy, they could stay at work. And because things like sleep and rest and social support, good food, just critical to the mental health of our soldiers. I think, in my military experience, that was sort of the seed of what we do now at Amen Clinics. So I actually was in when Germany was West Germany. I was infantry medic in the 3rd Armored Division.
wow.
We guarded the Fulda Gap. And I remember the barbed wire, the machine guns, protecting our West Germany from the Soviets. It's really great. You were there when the wall came down. But, you're seeing these big moments in history from that and the Gulf War. And you know how important the politics of what's happening in the world is to the health and welfare for not only soldiers, but their families and the communities, right?
Yes. I always thought of myself really modeled after my grandfather, I think, who, was just he looked like he could have walked out of a Norman Rockwell painting. And he was such a community doc. Everyone knew him in his church and around town. And I wanted to be a community doc as a psychiatrist. And in some ways, I didn't talk about this out loud because it sounded kind of outlandish, but I sort of saw the Army as my patient. And while, yes, I treated individuals and couples and families and did unit consultation and all the things that you would expect an Army psychiatrist to do, but I also reserved a sort of a lens for looking at the Army as a system, as my patient. And what could I do that could help this system, this patient, my Army, do its job even better? And
How does that translate to New York City? And
yes, so interestingly, it does translate to New York City, because as I've tracked the evolution and the discoveries coming out from neuroscience. And by the way, my sister Cheryl, I think I told you this the other day, she had flagged your work for me early on, must have been in the early 90s. And so I've been sort of a closet fan of yours. And I saw some of the stuff that you took, early on, in particular for having the audacity to look at the brain and to scan it and to treat the brain as the organ that it is. And I had my own experience with that a little bit later on. In fact, I took out my brain coin, Daniel. This was from the Defense Centers of Excellence. You'll see there's the soldier taking a knee with the brain in the background. And it's real warriors, real battles, real warriors, real strength, with the family ties there. And I very intentionally wanted my troops and their families to see their conditions as being real. And this brain coin made that point. And so coming into New York the years later, so, the leadership and all that I learned in the Army. I mean, Daniel, I was so lucky on so many levels. And yes, I worked hard, but I had the greatest mentors and experiences, was a White House fellow and a commander twice over, and then the founder of the Defense Centers of Excellence for Psychological Health and Traumatic Brain Injury. And that was really a pivotal experience. That was the end of my career, and it has a lot to do with then how I came into New York City. I had been selected to serve downrange as the command surgeon for the surge in 2007, General Petraeus. And a couple of things happened that year. My battle buddy, Brian Allgood, who was my predecessor in the command surgeon role, we'd worked together for years and were back and forth to ensure a strong handoff. Brian was shot down in the Chinook that what exploded in January of 2007. All the more reason I was pumped up to honor his service and to stand in his boot prints. And then the next month, the Army was in a complete shambles. The Walter Reed story about the shabby, unconscionable conditions. The medical care, by the way, was always top notch, but the leadership and the conditions were certainly abominable. And so the Army was in complete disarray. The next month, I was nominated for promotion to Brigadier General. That took away the deployment to Iraq. My next battlefield then became within the Beltway. And I'll never forget General Pete Schoolmaker, who was the Chief of Staff of the Army, who had been the commander of special operations before that. He took me aside before I penned on the star for Brigadier General. And he said, Loree, he says, just remember this. When you pin on those stars, one on each of your shoulders, it's something bright and shiny. People will look at it. They'll respect you. They'll stand up when you walk into the room. They'll salute you. But remember, that's the burden that you carry of command. It's the imperative, the duty that you have wearing these stars to get up every morning and fight for your troops, fight for their families, fight for the sergeants who are the backbone of the Army, and never, ever forget who you work for. Some of the most important guidance I ever received. And so we did what we did, the National Intrepid Center of Excellence, which opened 3 years later. People come from all over the country, all over the world, Daniel, to see what integrative rehabilitation for brain injuries, including the families, including research. It's like the Mayo Clinic. We went to the Mayo Clinic to model their program. And so when I retired from the Army then in late 2010, I'd been leading change for a while in a pretty tough system. And I didn't know what I was experiencing. And in fact, it took me a couple of years before I ran across the work of Maureen Duffy and Lynn Sperry. I was giving a talk at Oxford in England and saw at the Oxford University Press a book that they had just published on mobbing. It had all the research. I had scoured the literature on bullying. It just was so inept to capture what I had experienced those last couple of years. And I'll tell you, what a gift, Daniel, because, you know, bullying, one person picking on another, but mobbing is that primitive group animal instinct that, whether it's in birds, whether it's in condo associations, or where it's Nazi Germany, groups of animals will select one of their members and start ostracizing and pushing that member out. And what caught me about that work was, I was reading about the research. They said the immune system, the health impact of the person who is being mobbed and driven out of a system is akin to what we see in concentration camp survivors. That caught my attention. I have been spreading that gospel ever since, just to let folks know, to let HR folks know, to let leaders know there are mob-prone organizations, mob resistance. I have had countless people tell me that just knowing that there's a name to it, a body of literature. And then I met Dr. Duffy, and I was able to write a little blurb on her third set of books, this one teaming up with a legal team to really capture the legal and the human resources requirements of dealing with this phenomenon. But at any rate, back to the story of that was this healing journey where.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute, because I feel like that's what happened to me.
Okay, I'd love to hear about.
I'm a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. I was a Ginsberg Fellow when I was a resident at Walter Reed. I published 80 scientific papers. And when I said, no, you have to start looking at the brain. If you don't look, you don't know. I feel like that's exactly what happened to me, that the mob took over and diminished me. And thank God, brain health is my center. As far as why I'm on the earth is my center. So my immune system's really good, but it was war. You know, I still feel like that a little bit. And I have my own personal stories of my nephew and so on why I do what I do. But I get how painful that mobbing can be. I'm going to use that. I've not heard that term.
I'll share it. I'll share it with you, Daniel. Whether it was, I was at a press conference on Capitol Hill, and one of the senators came to me. I just mentioned, I didn't attach to my personal story, but just mentioned it as a phenomenon that people must know about, and then to name the resource. Senator came, whispered in my ear, said, "Thank God you gave this a name." And countless others have, just as you just did, have recounted their own experiences. And it's so important because it's devastating. It's absolutely devastating. And so I came out of the Army with such a devotion to this institution that I had given my entire adult life to up till that point. And yet I was pretty beat up. And the morning of the NYCO opening was just the toughest day of my life. This was my baby. I was supposed to be in the dais. There was a story on the NPR that morning saying that I had, abruptly left my position. And Daniel, waiting for the ceremony to start, I saw a young NCO. He was an E6 staff sergeant. He was been one of the soldiers who'd been brought in from Fort Polk to be there to witness this opening, this great resource, the NYCO. And so I went over and I just started talking to him. I said, "What do you think about all this, Sarge?" And he looked at me and his eyes welled up with tears. And he said, "Ma'am," he said, "this means the world to me and my buddies. Up until today, those of us suffering from PTSD," he said, "we didn't think anyone cared. We didn't think anyone believed us. We didn't think it was real even. We didn't know. But he says, this building and this ceremony today and all that's going to follow, this means the world. It tells us that we do matter. And again, I was reoriented. This is the guy that I work for. And so I made the promise I will do whatever it takes, whatever time, whatever is necessary to come out of this experience with a heart of gratitude and to embrace it as a gift. My Loree and I, we were introduced by Gary Trudeau of Doonesbury. So this is where the New York part of the story comes in. Loree and I moved to Santa Fe after I retired, but Gary got us back to New York, to his hometown, Saranac Lake. We stood up a veterans reintegration program. Jane and Gary had an extra apartment. We were back and forth. And Loree is an expert in trauma and resilience, and she and her colleagues had established a set of self-regulation skills. We were doing work around the country, around the world, and we got the bug. We loved New York. So finally we said, let's just move to Brooklyn for 3 years and not ask a single question. Well, that was in spring of 2013 when there was another mayor's race in just fevered pitch. I didn't know about the commissioner's position. You know, when several months later, Loree read one sentence in the Times that talked about the mayor has not yet appointed his commissioner for what was then the mayor's office of Veterans Affairs. She said, what do you think about this? I laughed. I said, I love it. I laughed again. I said, I don't bring anything to a new mayor. But, you know, I had learned over all those years in the Army, you know, if you do go for it, it's a long shot. If you don't, it's a sure shot. So go for it. And what I didn't know was the mayor and his wife, all four of their parents had been engaged in World War II, brought the war home with them. And so they had a clear picture in their mind of the blessings and the burdens of what it is to serve in a military and veteran family. And they wanted somebody who could make things different here and now for today's veterans and their families. Well, Daniel, by that reckoning, I was the perfect candidate. And so this has been a journey of a lifetime, an unbidden blessing, that to come into this tiny little office, which Mayor Ed Koch, himself a veteran, had stood up in the late 80s. Vietnam veterans were rightly pounding on the doors of City Hall, demanding respect and treatment and support and services. And to take that on, and a year later, we were making history, the first city in the country to stand up a municipal agency dedicated to the strengths and the needs of veterans and their families. And so that became a journey that over those next couple of years, really from 2018 forward, it was the best of times standing up this new agency, going from 4 to 44, small agency by city agency standards for sure. But we were building a laboratory and an incubator, and we could take on the toughest challenges facing the city, like homelessness, and have an outside impact by setting up what works for veterans and then applying it for the greater good. But at the same time, I started to see forces in the city that just bothered me terribly. The reactivity, you know, when AOC was elected, surprised everyone in New York City politics. Boy, fear ran rampant, and career politicians started just thronging to the far left and trying to curry favor, and a demonizing sort of rhetoric took hold, demonizing individuals, demonizing wealth, demonizing industries like real estate. And at the same time, because of the fractured relationship between the mayor and the governor, you know, we had the mayor decarcerating individuals from Rikers, but there was no attention paid to the 30 to 40% of those individuals who were seriously mentally ill. At the same time that the governor was making the budget numbers work and eliminating hospital beds and residential programs and treatment and substance misuse programs. And the seams that had never fit that tight were now just ripped. And the prevalence of suffering, the seriously mentally ill on the streets, the sidewalks, the subways, and the crime surge that started to take place in the city, Daniel, I asked myself, where's the leadership going to come from that can lift our city up and lead us forward, bring us together? And I didn't see it. And I kept looking. But I also heard in the back of my mind was John Gardner, who was a Marine. He was the founder of the White House Fellows Program. And one of the things he used to say was, who gives you permission to stand on the sideline when leadership in the public space, the public sphere, is desperately needed? And so I went to school to learn as much as I could about what it takes to run for mayor. And I talked to as many folks as I could. And you find that you reach a point, Daniel, where there's nothing more you can really learn. There's no one else you can talk to. It's just a leap of faith. And you just get out there and you start learning all over again on a whole new level. Well, I put my hat in the ring 14 months ago, early November, a week after I had stepped aside from my commissioner position. And I am more resolute with every passing day that this is the work of my soul and my being to offer my leadership to our city. And it's really not even about winning or losing the race. It's about being the best servant leader I can be, teaming up with experts like yourself who have been long working to alleviate suffering. And let's bring people together. Let's think of the city as sort of analogous to what I early on 30 years ago thought of as the Army. The Army is my patient, or the city as a system, and to think of the nervous system of the city. And what are the actions that leaders can take that will both calm that nervous system and help people to feel safe within the city? And what are the actions which really activate the city and drive those extremes towards reactivity and the fear and now the virus? I got into the race well before the pandemic started. So it's become
Right.
all the more pressing and poignant these last few months.
And so if you're mayor, how would you lead this city? And we can talk about it in a number of ways. I have a clinic in Manhattan.
Mhm.
So in many ways, I consider myself a New Yorker. It's on 40th between 5th and Madison, right next to Grand Central Station. And you just
You've got a
see
great team there. I've been there, and they're a great team. I mean, we started this conversation talking about veterans, and now to talk about firefighters and police officers and incarcerated individuals and what we can do to alleviate suffering together. But back to you, Daniel. You're a New Yorker. Yes, you are.
and I'm worried about the impact the pandemic has had on the city and on city businesses and safety. Tell me, as you've thought about this deeply, your priorities, your first 100 days. What will you do so that we don't feel the family dysfunction among the politicians? In New York, you're talking about the mayor and the governor, put that in with national politics, and it's like they need serious family therapy.
Well, I'll tell you, the first 100 days, let's pray that we're at a different place in recovering from this pandemic. I will be out in every borough those first 500 days, what I will have done in advance, because I am campaigning as I would govern, which means that I reach out to people. I ask them what's on their minds, what's the top issue that they would want to fix if they were mayor that would improve their lives, their business, their loved ones. And when you ask people that question, you get some really great ideas. And so we will find several visible projects that the communities themselves have identified. And in the first 100 days, we will stand up one of those very visible, very wanted, very needed projects in each of the boroughs, so that the New Yorkers in Staten Island, as much as the Bronx and Queens and Manhattan and Brooklyn, will all know that their voice matters. But they're going to know from me that I'm not a politician. I'm not that person who's going to say, vote for me and I'll take care of this. No. In fact, several months ago, I put my pronouns on my Twitter account. And it caused a little bit of a flutter at first, because people didn't know whether I was being snarky or disrespectful towards our brothers and sisters in the trans community and beyond. And my preferred pronouns are we, us, our. It's always been that way for me. When I applied for the White House Fellowship Program, people thought I was nuts, but my proposal for the president was to add a line to the national security strategy that said, promote strong communities at home. And so this isn't a lifelong orientation that I bring to our city. And we will develop inclusive processes. Tomorrow's when my safety plan comes out, Daniel. And, I've been saying for the last several months, communities need cops as much as cops need communities. But in this environment of hypercharged fear and reactivity and social media and all the rest, we're just going in all the wrong directions. Well, what I also say is that public safety is way too important to be left solely on the shoulders of the cops. So we're going to stand up a public safety coordination council with, the other relevant city agencies, education, transportation, emergency management, FDNY, of course, the police. And my office as mayor, we will drive and integrate that process. We'll bring in community advocates and community board leaders and members of the larger city body to have a process in which every voice counts, where accountability is sacrosanct. We will extend the data system so that we can have the analytics that help us spot the patterns that are starting to emerge wherever they are and wherever they surface in our city. And that will be the first really demonstrable model of the kind of inclusion, the kind of servant leadership that I grew up with in the Army and that I bring to any challenge, any organization that I have the privilege of leading. Now, for sure, public safety is the foundation, but we also have to be working like fury to speak with respect to all members of New York City. Right now, we have New Yorkers who have the means, who are outside of the city and who read the newspapers and don't feel safe, and they don't feel respected. They've heard the mayor say, the wealthy, who needs them? We'll be okay. No, it takes all of us in New York to make this city work. And to exclude and to marginalize the top 1% who bring in over 40% of the city's tax base, this is exactly the wrong time to turn up that rhetoric. Now, to be sure, we cannot tax our way out of this challenge. As I'm talking to some, wealthy folks across the city, they're saying, listen, we know we've done well even during this pandemic. We want to do something more. Maybe it's a surcharge, but, if you say you're just going to tax us and that we're going to be an ATM machine for the city, no, we're not staying. We'll take our companies, we'll take our residences, and we'll go elsewhere. And that would be the biggest tragedy of all, because the city then will not work. So my job is very clear cut. It's to earn the trust of communities, the trust of cops, the trust of corporate leaders, the trust of nonprofits, the trust of the tech community. I mean, we've got all of these different interlocking parts of these 8 million souls plus who make up our glorious city. And I just, 2 weeks from now, the second leg of my policy platform will be open for business. And this is where we have to we have to ensure that the thousands and thousands of small businesses, restaurants, bodegas, retail, Broadway, the very things that make New York City, New York, are at risk of going away forever.
Right.
And so I'm working right now, actually, with a company that has worked over the last 30 years to develop a technology using UVC radiation in a safe, contained, CDC compliant system that actually, unlike HEPA filters that just fold and exclude the pathogen, this brings in the air, kills the pathogen. If we can we've got a demonstration project in the works right now, a Broadway theater, a restaurant, a bodega, a school. If we can demonstrate that this technology, which is already in place in children's hospitals and McDonald's and Starbucks, if we can put it on overdrive to offer real hope. So no, we can't tax our way out of this. We can't demonize our way out of this. We have to engineer and innovate our way forward. And so this is just one of a number of things I'm working on. The next leg of my policy platform, you'll be pleased to hear, will be public health. And I will be
let's talk about that. Let's talk about mental health.
Yes.
Because it's the part of medicine that is often thought of last, even though depression, for example, is the world's most expensive illness. And if we don't work on optimizing the brain health and mental health of our communities, we're just going to spend more money on their physical health challenges. And so in the few minutes we have left, I mean, it's really a great thing for us to end on by talking about how do you think you can improve the collective brain health, mental health during your term as mayor?
Well, I think, first of all, to join forces with your campaign to overturn the use of the term mental health, which is just obsolete at this point. With all that we know about the brain and the mind-body system, and we know that the brain is connected to every single organ in the body, mental health just it's stigmatizing. It makes people uncomfortable, but it still makes them feel like this isn't real. But brain health, here we are. There's that organ. And I think importantly is for us to bring together then the various manifestations, both of brain health and brain illness, and to give people some of the basic things to talk about: sleep and hydration and social support, and yes, nutrients, the fuels that we put into our system, and to think about even the things we talked about last week, Daniel, to go to bed at night and say, what happened that was really great today? Who did I reach out to? Who reached out to me? How did we make the world a better place today? What a nice way to go to sleep and have a restful journey and retooling for the next day, when, as you said, you get up in the morning and say, this is going to be a great day. Those are easy things to do, but you and I both know they are powerful. And we must pay attention going forward every bit as much to the aspects of brain health that can manifest in serious illness. And we have to build out the structures that start with the community, the clubhouse model, the fountain house model here in New York. We're going to bring that to scale. We're going to bring the Thrive program, which I call the Strive program right now, which, we can bring that to fully meet its potential as the Thrive NYC program. But we have to work together in community with families, with NAMI, with folks like yourselves who have done so much work in these areas, and with our local, academic partners, our clinical partners, and schools and prisons and cop precinct houses. I mean, it's an all of city effort. And it I was talking to a group of leaders earlier today, and we were talking about this concern. And I was asked about, what do you think about peer-to-peer certification programs? And I said, my Core 4 whole health model, which has, think of a pyramid, C4 at the top, clinical treatment, all was non-negotiable. But the foundation, culture, inspiration, and the arts, C2, social connection. That's the optimal point of entry. That's the peer-to-peer bond. C3, the community holistic services, things that people called me and DOD crazy for investing in the research years ago. Tai Chi, acupuncture, service dog therapy, equine therapy, but that can be the bridge to helping someone both re-regulate, to restore their capacity for safe and trusting relationships. And if they're still having some difficulty, of course, send them to the Amen Clinic. Let them get their SPEC scan. Let them get the whole assessment. It's like when I introduced the brain coin to my team years ago, and there were some folks who were horrified. What does the brain have to do with what we do in mental health? And I said, wait a second. If we're not paying attention to the brain, it's like a mechanic who never lifts up the hood of the car. Well, I think we're well.
I've used that analogy.
Yeah, we're well beyond that.
We're running out of time, and I'm just so excited about the possibility of having a leader who has led in many ways before with a large system like the Army. If people want to support your campaign, how can they do that?
Sure. Actually, the website is Loree for Mayor. That's LOREE for FOR Mayor MAYOR .NYC. And Daniel, I'll make sure that Natalie on your team has the donate link and all the rest. I will tell you this. Right now, we're in the middle of a really important week leading up to the next filing this month. And so we're closing in on meeting our thresholds, but we have to get to 1,000 unique New York City residents, $10 each. And we are just, all hands on deck, and we're giving it everything we got. But if you think it's important, whether you live in New York City or not, if you think it's important for someone like me at a time like this to lead a city like New York, now's the time to invest, and $10 makes a huge difference. And I just thank you for asking. This is not a comfortable conversation for me to have. It's never been my life work in the Army to make these kinds of statements or pitches. But let me just say this I'm very comfortable saying. People have asked me over the last 14 months, tell us, why would you be the best candidate for mayor? And I'm so comfortable answering that question. I'm not going to tell you I'm the best candidate for mayor. My job is to tell you who I am, what my values are, what I know, what I stand for. Back to the NCOs, the non-commissioned officers, be, know, and do. Starts with who you are. Then that shapes what you learn and what you know. And then that finally leads to the actions you take. And so my job is to do exactly what I'm doing with you in this wonderful interview, and then trust New Yorkers to decide who do they want, who's best for them in our city to lead going forward. And if I'm in that position, I will tell you what a joy, what a glory. But I'll tell you what, if someone else earns that trust, I'm going to keep on serving. Daniel, you haven't heard the end of me. We're going to continue this brain health campaign, this revolution, because this is work worth doing. And,
Well, I appreciate you so much, my friend. And for those of you that are interested, Loree, LOREE for mayor.nyc. I never publicly support anybody because, at Amen Clinics, if you're red or blue or green or purple, we want to serve. But the opportunity to have someone of your education background to add some sanity back in what's really become an insane process, political process. I'm all for you. So let's say goodbye to everybody, and then I'll stay on with you just for a minute. So thanks everybody for watching. Loree for mayor.nyc. Take care.